Welcome to Disciples of Christ History. My name is Steve Regas. I'm a member here at Liberty Christian Church in Liberty, Missouri. I am leading a 15-week series on the history of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. I've been asked to say a little bit how this series came about. A few of you may know that I'm currently working on a book called Seeking Christ. It's about the difference between liberal Christians and conservative Christians. In the end, it will suggest at least to find a way to bridge their differences. In working on that book, I recently completed a pretty long chapter on the history of Christianity. The second factor is that Dave Culver, the pastor of this congregation, asked me last summer to teach a series on the history of the disciples of Christ, as there were a fair number of members of this congregation who really weren't aware of that. The third factor came in, and this got the region involved. I'm currently mentoring a candidate for commissioning in the region. And as part of the process, he has to take a class in the history and polity of the disciples of Christ. Unfortunately, there's no really good local option for that. And in speaking with the region, they said if he watches this series, it would fulfill that criteria for him, but they would also like to put it on the regional website for anyone else who wanted to study the history and polity of the disciples of Christ. I am honored to have you as my guest for this, and thank you for being here. Hello, welcome to week 12. Anybody remember the most famous, one of the most famous lines in English literature? Charles Dickens. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Also, the group Styx did a great song in the early 80s with that title. This is week 1 of the best of times, the worst of times. 1865 to 1940. And the era, the 40 years after the Civil War, was one of the most interesting, one of the most productive times in disciple history. The United States went from a population of about 31 million to 76 million in like 35 years. The disciples, this is amazing, went from 192,000 in 1860 to 1.12 million in 1900, in 40 years. Now, and we grew at twice the rate of the nation. Alexander Campbell died in 1866, and he was already senile. But when he passed and the Civil War was over, we suddenly had a new generation of leadership. And there's two names, there's only 4 things I want you to remember today. There's 2 names. John W. McGarvey, Herbert Willett, who was one of my disciple heroes. And there's 2 newspapers, the Christian Standard, which I believe still exists, and the Christian Evangelist. And if you remember those things, it will serve you well. Now, and I wrote these like this because while neither one of these men owned neither one of these papers, they are linked. It's been said that disciples don't have bishops, they have editors. And it's somewhat odd today that in a denomination that produced scores of magazines, scores of newspapers, far more than we could ever support, that we have no magazine now. The Disciple, which was y'all remember the Disciple magazine? I see some heads bobbing. I spelled something wrong. The Disciple magazine was the successor of this way down the road. And I forget, it probably failed 15, 20 years ago. There was another magazine that tried to replace it, Disciple World, and that maybe made it 2 years. So one of the difficulties we have is, you walk into church, do you remember at a point in time you walked into church and there would be a copy of the Disciple there? Or it went to people's homes? We have no such magazine. Now, how do you know what's going on when there's no official denominational magazine? But at one time, obviously before the internet, obviously before TV, even some of this before radio, one of the ways that you conveyed your opinions was through newspapers. And again, your own newspapers. And not the Kansas City Star, the Kansas City Times, but there were, disciples just loved to publish papers. And we're going to run into that today. Now, I said I was only going to ask you 2 names, but in these years, who was the most famous disciples of Christ of all? Anybody heard the name James Garfield? The 20th President of the United States. He's one of the least remembered presidents for an unfortunate reason. Do you remember what it was? He was assassinated. If you want to read a story about what medicine was like in the 19th century, he would have lived easily today, but he was shot. He lived 2 months after the shooting. His doctors took unsterilized fingers and tried to pull the bullet out. But he died 7 months into his presidency, and the last 2 he was mortally ill. So he's not one of our most famous presidents, but if you think about it, this was a movement, the Disciples of Christ were a movement that started in the early 1800s, and by 1880, one of our members was elected president. Actually, he's the only ordained minister who became president of the United States. He'd served in ministry early in his career. And I think I told you the story. It was during his very brief presidency that I think he worshiped at the Vermont Avenue Christian Church. And it was a very undistinguished structure. And his horsemen thought it was degrading that the President of the United States would go to this building. So he parked the carriage waiting for Mr. Garfield near a nicer church. Anyway. In 1865, besides the war ending, something happened. We had colleges. Alexander Campbell founded Bethany College about 1840. But our first school for educating ministers was formed, the College of the Bible. And do you know anybody who graduated from the College of the Bible? You know Laura Phillips? By the time she went there, it was called Lexington Theological Seminary. But it was our first basically graduate institution for training ministers was the College of the Bible. And it's interesting that in Disciples of Christ terminology, we didn't have seminaries. The school I graduated from, Bright Divinity School, when it was incorporated, was called Bright College of the Bible. Why were they called College of the Bible and not seminaries? Because we weren't theologians. Theologians were, Presbyterians and Methodists, and worst of all, Catholics, that brought their ideas from the old world. We didn't have doctrine. We had the Bible, by golly. And so we called our schools colleges of the Bible. Apparently it wasn't until the 1950s that it was okay to talk about a disciple scholar as a theologian. So the College of the Bible, and even though he didn't found it, the man who became most familiar with it was J.W. McGarvey. He was an old-time fundamentalist. I forgot where he was born. He actually spent like 10 years in Missouri preaching. He was educated at Bethany College under the Campbells. He early on came to the College of the Bible. So basically from 1865 to when he died in 1911, it was his baby. And Megan, I hate to pick on you, but since I think you're the only librarian in the room, You're okay.
I'll take her bar. She's current. I'm way too old.
Well, this would have been the easiest librarian gig on the face of the earth. They didn't buy very many books at College of the Bible, and they only had like subscriptions to 8 periodicals. And it really didn't matter because in their 1 year, their whole student body checked out a total of 260 books, period. Because why do you need a book when you have Brother McGarvey? And that's what they called him, friend and foe alike, Brother McGarvey. And it was a disciple scholar, Gene Boring, jokingly said he should have been called Father McGarvey because it's interesting, McGarvey was very anti-German. But you could picture him in the German accent, this you must believe. That basically he had 2 books in class. The only 2 books you need at College of the Bible. One was, of course, the Bible. And you know who wrote the other book? J.W. McGarvey. He had one trip outside the United States. He went to the Holy Land, which, in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, for an American, that was a big deal. He wrote a book about the Holy Lands, and that and the Bible were the only textbooks. And he did not encourage people to read widely. And he was a very smart man. He was quite good in Greek and Hebrew. He read the newest stuff. But it was kind of like, I will read this, I will process this, I will decide what's good for you to hear, and you don't need to know anything else. And that's why nobody checked out books, because you had Brother McGarvey. And by golly, that's how it was. Now, I'm sure this next statement will come as no surprise to the ladies in the room. That men don't do things nearly as well as women. I see some female heads bobbing. I see one saying no. The men of the Disciples of Christ in 1850 organized, and this terminology gets more and more and more letters. The American Christian Missionary Society, 1850. And 20 years later, and this is run by men, and this is in the great century of evangelizing, what would have been called the heathen then, other places, non-Christian places in the world. After 20 years, and admittedly, there was a civil war going on. How many missionaries did the men send out in their 20 years of running the organization? 3. And one of them died 2 months after he got there. So they weren't doing a very good job of it. It was about 1873, 1874. Disciple women, when they saw what women in other denominations were doing, said, can't we do this here, since obviously the men aren't doing a very good job? So they formed the Christian Women's Board of Missions. And when the ladies got involved and started raising money, things took off. And they not only sent missionaries to what we would call the third world, they did mission work at home. Now, this is an interesting point. The Episcopal Church didn't ordain women until the 1970s. I believe the Methodists and Presbyterians started ordaining women in the 1950s. When did disciples ordain women? Somewhere time before the turn of the last century. Probably in the 1880s, certainly in the 1890s. But before we congratulate ourselves too much on, aren't we open-minded? Do you know why we ordained women? Was it theology? It was frugality. In those days, ordained ministers got a break on train fares. And so as the women did their missionary work, they realized we could save money if we're reverends. And so kind of without discussion, they were ordained to save money. So I've heard disciples speak, just brag about we ordained women back then, but they don't typically say why we did it. So the women began to have success, and so the men said, we can't let them top us. So then they formed the Foreign Christian Missionary Society. You see how this gets complicated? I need a soda, hang on. The Foreign Christian Missionary Society. And between these two groups, things really began to take off. Now, we did have the problem we talked about briefly, that after the Civil War, there was resentment in Southern churches over the war. And again, like so many things in churches, fights often don't happen. The ostensible reason for the split is not the real reason. In the disciples, as the northern churches got more prosperous, would you like to sing a cappella in our worship? Whether you're contemporary or traditional, most of us wouldn't want to sing a cappella. And a lot of disciples in the north said, we can buy instruments. Why not have them in worship? And, we don't need these crummy little buildings like President Garfield worshiped in. We could have nice buildings with stained glass windows. We don't have to rely on part-time preachers. We can afford full-time trained preachers. And so the poor churches in the South looked up at the churches in the North and they were envious. But you can't split up because of envy. What they said was, well, this isn't in the Bible. This isn't in the New Testament. If you do these things, you're breaking with the tradition of our founders. Well, of course, we're no longer there to confirm or deny that. And so the split occurred basically with the Church of Christ between about 1885 and 1895. We lost 175,000 members, which was a little over 10%. And most of those were in little poor churches in the South. And during this time, there was a war of the journals. There were four main journals. Two of them supported the Church of Christ, and two of them supported the more progressive forces. And it was these two. They were the progressive journals. And of the two, at one time, the Christian Standard was the most important one. It had the bigger following. And it was at one time the more progressive one. But time changes things. Now, do you remember the story in Genesis? I'm trying to find where I have this. Where Cain and Abel offer their sacrifices to God, and Abel's is accepted and Cain's isn't, and there's the story that sin is crouching at the door. Amidst all the success that we're having, and even losing the Church of Christ, we're sending all these missionaries out, we're moving across the United States, forming churches. There was trouble afloat. And it started, in some ways, one of the ways it started was in the missionary work. You send people to foreign countries, countries where Christians are a very, very small minority. One of the things that missionaries did in those days was sign what was called comedy, not comedy, comedy agreements. And it was basically like, you take this territory, we'll take this territory, we're all Christians, we'll do this. But here's the problem. Or we'll start a unified church. If you say lived in a part of China that was evangelized by the Methodists and had been sprinkled when you became a Methodist, and then you moved to a part that was controlled by the disciples' churches, Were you a member of the church? Were you a Christian? Well, you hadn't been baptized, immersed for the remission of your sins. On the foreign mission field, the question was, would we accept other people? It's the old open membership question. And this is something that comes up again and again and again. Some of you, a few of you here are mature enough to remember when we didn't talk about the disciples of Christ as a denomination very much. Do you remember that? What was the term we had for ourselves? And this sounds very sexist now. The brotherhood. And the reason was that everybody else was the denominations. We were the brotherhood because our whole movement was, you remember, not the only Christians, but Christians only. You know, as we had this whole giant organization develop, we had the fantasy, oh yeah, we're a movement, we're not a denomination. Yeah, right. It looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck. But that was the fantasy that was maintained. And some people thought it was stupid. But the old timers didn't. And the problem is that if you, on the mission field, if you cooperate with the denominations like you were a denomination, isn't that repudiating the whole point we're here? And indeed, you have these hardliners that say, if you're not immersed for the remission of your sins, you're not a Christian, period. So why on the mission field are we even cooperating with these people? And so as time goes on, particularly in Asia, we begin to get in these situations where our missionaries are cooperating with others. And they are no doubt practicing open membership. Now, anyway, I was going to go on a tangent. I'll hold off on that. As the church spread across North America, as we began this giant missionary empire, there was a big problem. By 1909, we had 11,000 churches in the United States, most of those having been built in the last 40 years. What does it take to build a church? Money. And do secular lenders always want to loan to a church? No. So where do you get your money from? About 1883, what became the Board of Church Extension was founded. And again, Missouri is not flyover territory. The Board of Church Extension was originally in Kansas City because it was considered nearest the missionary growth in Kansas and Texas. And Oklahoma wasn't open for settling yet. Later, actually, you remember the famous, when they opened the strip of land in Oklahoma, Indian Territory, and the people all lined up on the border of Kansas and rode in? The Board of Church Extensions actually had a missionary who rode in to claim territory for a church. By 1900, there were 600 congregations that had been partially funded by the Board of Church Extension. But that wasn't the only thing that was going on. You remember early on that a lot of disciples, ministers were bivocational. Barton Stone was bivocational his whole life. Now, you've always heard the story about the pulpit committee that begins its search for a pastor with the prayer, Lord, give us a pastor who's humble and poor. You keep her humble, we'll keep her poor. That you don't make a lot of money in ministry, particularly if you're bivocational. And as the movement got along, there were older ministers, or often widows of pastors, who were in desperate financial straits. And it was in the, let me find it here. In the late 1800s, It was originally called the Board of Ministerial Relief. And that later in the early 20th century became what we call today the pension fund. So again, we're beginning to develop a denominational structure. We've got these mission boards, we've got a board of church extension, we're developing a pension fund, we've got college, seminary. What's the one thing we need? Our own publishing house. Now, I've been railing the last 3 weeks about the historical critical method and promising you that yes, it does apply to us. And again, Missouri isn't flyover territory. The historical critical method really hit the disciples of Christ in 1889. A man named Robert Cave, who preached in St. Louis, Missouri, was influenced by the new theories. And unlike some of the early moderates, he wasn't lukewarm. I mean, he basically said, hey, I believe this. There's no virgin birth. There's no literal resurrection. Abraham was not asked to kill Isaac. Jephthah was not told to kill his daughter. It's all a bunch of myths. Well, obviously, in 1889, that didn't go over very well. So it was probably about 1890 that he quit being a Disciples of Christ minister, and I believe became a Unitarian. But the genie was out of the box. Suddenly the historical critical method became an issue. And part of the reason it became an issue was the Christian standard. It had been more moderate, but was becoming more conservative. And even though Brother McGarvey didn't own it, he was a frequent contributor. Now, after this incident in 1893, McGarvey began to write a regular column in the Christian Standard about the error of the historical critical method. And supposedly McGarvey was a nice guy, but apparently these columns were very, very mean, that ridiculed people who taught the historical critical method. And of course, at the College of the Bible, where he was dean, president, God, whatever, they didn't teach it, and they thought it was bad. And I told you he was very anti-German. One of his ways of getting it was, a lot of the original historical critical people were in Germany, and he was always dissing, oh, that's from Germany, you don't want that. So the historical critical method enters 1889. McGarvey starts writing his essays in 1893. The Christian Evangelist, becoming the more moderate paper, in 1899, they asked Herbert Willett to write the rest of the story. Willett's going to write in articles about why the new historical critical method is good. So if you're a disciple, every week you get these papers. The Christian Standard that says historical critical is bad, the Christian Evangelist that says it's good. And the issues that we looked at the last 3 weeks would have been commonplace to any of its readers. That was one of the issues. But again, there were other things going on. In roughly 1907, there was something called the Federal Council of Churches formed. It was an attempt at unity. And you remember that Stone and Campbell talked about we want unity in the church based upon going back to the New Testament principles. But they each had a different emphasis. Campbell was more on, let's get back to what the New Testament said, and Stone was like, no, let's go more with the unity. Now, progressives in the movement now and then focused on the unity aspect. The Federal Council of Churches that was formed among Protestant denominations, I mean, certainly nobody was progressive enough to think that Catholics could join, was formed in 1907, and disciples were involved. But again, if you're part of the Christian Standard crowd, if you're part of J.W. McGarvey crowd, and you believe that disciples of Christ were put on the earth for the sole purpose of bringing unity in the church through the New Testament, we're the brotherhood, they're denominations. Why the heck are we making a union with the denominations? I mean, that's, in their mind, that's so wrong. How could you even come up with the idea? So you have unity, you have open membership, if not at home, then in the mission field. You have the historical critical method. And as we move into the 20th century, these items are starting to percolate. Let me talk about Herbert Willett. Interesting guy. Like McGarvey, he trained at Alexander Campbell School, Bethany College. Got a bachelor's and master's degree there. Preached for a while, but then he did something different. He went to Yale. He got a seminary degree at Yale, and then he met a man named William Rainey Harper, who, if I remember the story right, I mean, Willett was a brilliant man. And when he got a seminary degree, he was just going to go back and preach. And William Rainey Harper was moving from Yale to the University of Chicago, that was new at that time, and said, "You're not doing any such thing. Your people, the disciples, need to know about this new method of the Bible, and you're going to be the one that does it." And that's exactly what happened. He followed William Rainey Harper to the University of Chicago. He got a PhD in Old Testament, and he became part of what was called the Chicago School, a group of liberal theologians, many of them disciple, who influence the progressive part of Protestantism for the next century. And it's interesting, we call ourselves a New Testament people, but the most famous scholar we ever produced, Herbert Willett, was an Old Testament scholar. But he, perhaps more than anybody in America, certainly in the disciples, took the idea of historical criticism and explained it to the people, in no small part because of his column every week in the Christian Evangelist. Questions so far? Yeah.
Couple, actually. The first one is this, earlier you referred to this board forming and then helping to fund churches. Where did this board get their money?
I'm not sure where they got their money initially. I know where they get their money now, is that sometimes it's churches that have extra money invest there. Sometimes it's well-off disciples put their money there. And there's a little bit of a leap of faith there, because unlike the bank, the Board of Church Extension is not FDIC insured. Certainly in this day and age, they're getting it from churches who place their endowments there and from well-off disciples who put their money there. I can't speak to the situation then, but that is how it works now.
Then the second question, I may have misheard you. I thought you said that between the two, the Christian Standard was the more progressive.
Initially it was. That changed later, but initially they had, one of their co-editors was very conservative and their editor was liberal. When those guys died, situations changed. So, do we have any baseball fans here? Any of you ever go to any of the old baseball stadiums? And this one's I don't know what they call the baseball stadium in Pittsburgh now, but it used to be Three Rivers. You remember what it was called, the stadium before Three Rivers? Forbes Field. Forbes Field probably closed about 1970. Anybody go to a game there? Didn't think so. In 1909, the Disciples of Christ held their centennial convention at Forbes Field. And I guess they had a very elaborate outdoor communion service, to, I don't want to say to feed 50,000 people, but you know what I mean. And of course, they had a steamboat that was going to go to Africa to convert the heathen, and they had it on display there, and people go down and see where Alexander Campbell lived. And of course, they had speakers. What's interesting is that Two of the three churches I've served as pastor were in existence in 1909. And there's a famous, they have such a big deal that both of those churches still in their libraries in the 1980s had the program, and the Christian Standard printed it. But oh my gosh, one of the speakers was Herbert Willett. And you can actually read this, that there's a disclaimer in the front. Christian Standard says, we are only printing this because we'd agreed to. If it was up to us, we would not have this man here. So we just want to, wash our hands of the fact that this horrible, godless, liberal Herbert Willett was allowed to speak. So anyway, disciple ministerial education. Phillips Theological Seminary didn't start till 1907. Bright Divinity School didn't start till 1913. The conservative school was then the College of the Bible, headed by J.W. McGarvey. And as long as Brother McGarvey was alive, it was going to stay conservative. Now, a lot of the traditional disciple schools weren't there yet. So where did progressive disciples go? Where Willett was, the University of Chicago. And even though it's not a disciple school, it had still does have a profound influence on the disciples of Christ. Probably early 20th century, late 19th century, the disciples of Christ had so many students there, they actually formed the Disciples Divinity House, where disciples could live and hang out together and learn disciple stuff, but still go to the University of Chicago Divinity School at the same time. So basically, you started having these polarized camps. There were the College of the Bible people, conservatives, the Chicago people, moderates, liberals. These people believed in closed membership. These people believed in open membership. These people didn't believe in the historical critical method. These people did. These people did not agree with associated with the denominations. These people did. So if you have that much going on, what's going to happen? Problems. So let me do two things. Let me wipe this board down and have a Coke and talk amongst yourselves. Whoops. Okay. All the agencies, the American Christian Missionary Society, the Foreign Christian Missionary Society, the Christian Women Boards of Missions, there was later an African American one, the National Christian Missionary Convention, the Board of Church Extension, the National Benevolent Association, the Ministerial Board of Ministerial Relief, agency after agency was created. And that became an administrative nightmare. So what did the disciples of Christ decide to do? Create an umbrella organization. So, okay, let's see if you can figure this out. We have the American Christian Missionary Society, the Foreign Christian Missionary Society, the Christian Women Board of Missions. If we want to unite them all under umbrella, what do we call it? The United Christian Missionary Society. And so this was in 1920 United Christian Missionary Society was formed. It didn't incorporate all the boards, but a lot of them. And it had a very unique feature. And again, you've got the Christian Standard crowd, the conservatives, the Christian evangelist crowd. One of the things that really ticked the conservatives off, remember, who supported a lot of the mission work? The women. And they had female boards. Now suddenly they're asked to turn over their assets to this group. If you were a woman on the board of the Christian Women's Board of Missions, what would you think about that? Fine, but we get 50% representation on the board. This is 1920. That's the year women were given the right to vote in the United States. Half of this board is female. But if you're a Bible-thumping fundamentalist, you don't trust missionary societies anyway, and suddenly there's a 50% female board, what are you going to think of this organization? I mean, that's really, really advanced for the time. So that's one thing conservatives had against it. The other thing was it was born under a cloud of suspicion. Without a doubt, our missionaries in China were practicing open membership. Word got back, to the little Disciples of Christ churches in places like Hiawatha, Kansas, Liberty, Missouri, Comanche, Texas, where I served. Do you know what's happening in China? They're taking unimmersed people as full members. And it's kind of like my parents in the car. They own the car. If I displease them, what would happen to my keys? Take it away. It's like we're providing the money for these missionaries. Forget what they want. We're paying for it, and we don't believe in it. So there was a backlash because the liberals, the missionaries were more liberal than the people who were paying their salaries wanted. And so there was one or two fact-finding commissions. And depending on which side you read, the progressives say, oh no, we weren't doing this. The conservatives say, yes, you were doing this. In either case, they tried to reach a compromise, but nobody was pleased. And this is the mess the United Christian Missionary Society inherited when it was formed in 1920. And so there was arguing about this. And have you ever been to a meeting where you were totally outvoted? What does that feel like? And what happens if you get outvoted the next year and the next year and the next year and you don't think it's not just a matter of business, but a matter of principle. What do you finally do? We're Americans. We vote with our feet. If you don't like Coke, you get Pepsi. If you don't like Pepsi, you get Royal Crown. I don't know anybody has Royal Crown anymore, but. And every year the disciples had a convention, and every year the conservatives got voted down. And so finally, it's like the little kid on the playground. I'm going to take my ball and go home, start my own game. And that's what happened. In 1927, the conservatives got tired of being voted down by the moderates, so they formed their own convention, the North American Christian Convention. And oftentimes, it was held in the same town and the same time as the official disciple convention. And they were part of the same denomination. Nobody had officially broken away. But you ever get a crack in your windshield, a little crack? What happens? It gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so, up until 1927, the two sides were at least in the same room. They're still in the same denomination, but the disciples are going to the International Christian Convention, and the conservatives are going there. So they're at least in the same city. But this is really where the split starts and what becomes the independent Christian church. Two other things. No one, no matter how influential they are, lives forever. And John W. McGarvey died in 1911, and he had been at the College of the Bible over 50 years. That was the conservative bastion. They hired 5 faculty members. 4 of them were liberals. But their dean, and I love this name, Hall Calhoun. Hall Calhoun was, I guess, an ostrich. He was a Bible-thumping fundamentalist who went to Harvard and got a PhD and never changed his mind about anything. He came out of Harvard just as conservative the day he started, and he became the dean. You know, you remember the story of Thomas Campbell when he's on the frontier and he's serving communion to Presbyterians? And who squeals on him? Who tells on him? The student minister. You got to watch this. Teachers know you got to watch the students. So there's a student in College of the Bible who's now got these liberal professors and a conservative dean who, the kid writes an article, it's like, in the Christian Standard, about how all these liberal teachers are destroying their faith. So that provokes in 1917 a heresy trial. Now, again, this is a fellowship, the disciples, that has no creed. If you have no formal creed, how can you have heresy? But they had basically a heresy trial. And the 4 liberal professors were vindicated. And Hall Calhoun got mad and stormed off and left and finally became a member of, I think, the Church of Christ. But from 1917, this is when it wasn't just the University of Chicago, it's when all of our schools began to move to the left. And the historical critical method was well established. There's one other incident that leads up to this. You have the Christian Evangelist, which is the progressive paper, the Christian Standard, which is the conservative paper. Now, what do they say now? All you need is a computer and $3,000 to publish a book. But at one time, publication was not easy or cheap. The Christian Standard had done very well. It was the most popular paper. The Christian Evangelist struggled to survive. And more than one editor was on the brink of financial ruin trying to keep this baby going. Any of you know Kansas City figure, a man named R.A. Long? Ever seen the Liberty Memorial? The Liberty Memorial was a project of R.A. Long's after the First World War, where he encouraged common people to donate small amounts of change to subscribe to the $2 million to build it. Any idea how long it took Mr. Long to get the $2 million? It's like less than 2 weeks. He was a mover and shaker. He made his money in the lumber business. He started Longview Farms. He was a very, very, very dedicated member of the Disciples of Christ. How many of you have been in Independence Boulevard Christian Church? You know, it's not much to look at now, but that was an amazing structure at one time. You ever wonder how, in a blue-collar Catholic neighborhood, this palatial Disciples of Christ church got built? It was R.A. Long's church. You know the Kansas City Museum? That was his house. And so he needed a church close by. He was a very wealthy man, very committed to disciples. If he had had his way, Indianapolis would not have been the center of the disciples. It would have been Kansas City. I mean, he had plans to move everything here. That didn't happen. But one of the things he felt was that the Disciples of Christ needed an in-house journal. So the Christian Standard is doing just fine, but the Christian Evangelist is struggling. He bought it and gave it to the denomination. Now, of course, he was like president for life. But he gave it to the denomination. So you've got the Christian Standard, we'll just put CS, the conservative voice. You've got the Christian Evangelist, the progressive voice. And of course, the denomination, the brotherhood itself, is doing all these progressive things. Now all of a sudden, what's the difference between these two? This is owned by a private company, and this is owned by the denomination. So if you were already suspicious of the Herbert Willett Group, the Indianapolis Group, the United Christian Missionary Society, suddenly by 1910, they're the ones who are officially speaking for the denomination. And, those lines were drawn. What happened to America in the world in 1929? Depression started. And I was reading somewhere they said that church giving is the first to be cut out and the last to be restored when times get tough. And, in a period of a few years, our mission work was hurting badly. Deeply, United Christian Missionary Society was in trouble. They began to cut positions. They actually expected employees to be paid for 10 months and work for 12. You had 2 free months you put in. Finally, by the later 1930s, things came back. It's interesting that in the 1930s, there was within the Disciples of Christ a strong pacifist movement. And the Disciple Peace Fellowship was formed in 1935. And it was a fairly strong pacifist movement until the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And then there was a little bit of division because some of the really left-wing people, no, we're not going to go to World War II. Most disciples said, of course, we're going to World War II. Anyway, that takes us up to 1940.